All righty. Hello, all, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you are. My name is Ayana Wallace View. I'm a training and technical assistance manager with UJIMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We are one of five nationally designated culturally specific resource centers. And we have our wonderful CEO on the call with us today. I'm really excited. I love training with Karma and having great conversations. Today, I know you all signed up. If you're like, what did I sign up for? I can't remember. We're talking all about supporting Black survivors in rural communities today. This is a capacity building webinar, and really our aim is to explore the unique challenges and strengths faced by survivors or experienced by survivors in rural communities, to really think about strategies for culturally specific safety planning, and again, delving into what community means and how we can show up in community with survivors. I am going to welcome again Karma Kottman, who is our CEO, and then we'll jump into some questions. But for this workshop, I definitely want folks to understand because we're doing capacity building, we're going to do it together. And so there will be some questions that I pose to you all first before Karma answers. Please feel free to use the chat box or raise your hand. I'll take you, you can take yourself off of mute, and we'll just roll through the conversation that way. So again, welcome, Karma Kottman, who's our Chief Executive Officer with UJIMA, again, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Karma has successfully advocated for federal funding to support the development and implementation of culturally specific organizations in the Violence Against Women Act, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, and the Violence of Crimes Act for decades. She's an international expert on domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence, and has dedicated over 30 years to enhancing the services and responses for victims through tech training and technical assistance to SAAs of Stop Formula, FIPSA, VOCA grants and education, grants and education and advocacy in federal, state, and local policymaking. Ms. Kottman also established the Transitional Housing TTA project at the Maryland Network. I'm talking about my own experience at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, providing specialized training and technical assistance to domestic violence and sexual assault organizations seeking to establish and implement transitional housing for victims. As executive director of the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence for a decade, Ms. Kottman incubated programs specifically serving at-risk communities in Washington, D.C., including community violence initiatives. She is a nationally recognized expert on the housing needs of victims through her role at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, where she directed the housing TTA for state domestic violence coalitions, and in her capacity as the co-director of the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence Rural Diversity Initiative. So really, of course, great experience, great perspective joining the conversation today. Again, Karma, love being in space with you and having these conversations. So really happy that you joined us today.
It's one of my favorite things to train with you, Ayana. So I'm so excited to be here. I'm excited to be in community and really looking forward to this conversation, which, as you explained, is going to be a rich dialogue, but it won't just be us talking. So
Right.
I'm also really excited to hear from other experts in the room.
Awesome. So I'm gonna kick it off with, really thinking about your career and where it's taken you so far. What's the first thing that comes to mind that you want folks to understand about survivorship in rural communities?
Well, the first thing that is really interesting for me is that I started my work in Florida as the co-director of the Rural Diversity Initiative there at the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So have deep roots in this work as it relates to rural communities and Black survivors. But also, I don't know any Black child that didn't grow up going down south over the summer or visiting a grandma or aunt or uncle in the South. And so the roots are both professional and personal. And I think that blends the story around survivorship. The story
Hmm.
of survivorship for us as Black communities is intertwined. And so when I think about Black survivors, I think that you can't divorce our experiences from the richness of what it means to live in rural communities, the ties that bind us in rural communities, the history that we have that's both tied to the land, but also tied to our families, tied to our churches. And so I think that our experiences, what lifts up for me and what comes to the front for me, particularly for Black survivors in rural communities, is understanding that we're not a monolith, that we show up in across economic spectrums. We show up as African Americans, as Afro Latine, as African immigrants, all still living across and in rural communities across the country. And I think it's also important to acknowledge and recognize oftentimes when we talk about rural communities, we think we're talking about the deep south, right? And recognizing that rural communities exist across the country, and you find us as Black women, as Black survivors in all of those spaces and places.
Absolutely. I was even thinking about, I laugh because I was telling my mom I live in Baltimore City now, and I would have never expected it to be so rural as it is in a lot of different areas. And so, exactly to your point, we have to really expand what we're thinking of
Yeah.
when we talk about rural. So, we're going to get to barriers, of course, but I think it's great to always start with strength.
Mhm.
What strengths do you identify or have you identified that already exist within the Black community that absolutely support survivor safety?
Right. So I think, especially in rural communities, community, just starting with that framing around what community means, the togetherness, the ability to rely on each other, the ability to be there for each other, the strong faith ties, intergenerational ties, where you see intergenerational families, ties to land, not just people, but ties also to land and space, the feeling of home, right? And
Mm,
the feeling of connectedness. And those things, particularly when you think about rural communities where people are coming together to help each other, to be there for each other. I think about the roots of the work as domestic violence. And I grew up in this work, having discussions about what it meant not only to go to shelter, but to stay on someone's living room couch, and
mhm.
to use their extra bedroom. And those are still things that I see happen in rural communities, and really sort of the strength of what it means to be a part of something rather than just, showing up in a space.
Hmm. And immediately when you were talking about intergenerational families being a strength, I thought back to, some of my previous experience and how it's framed of like multi-generational families in one house. It's overcrowded versus it's, a whole bunch of experience and layers and, family networks going on there. What other assumptions, perhaps, do you think advocates or other service providers make about rural survivors that should either be challenged or reframed?
Well, the first one, particularly for Black communities, and I see this often when you're in major cities, is that we aren't there.
Mm,
And so the recognition that we are in rural communities, there, yes, certainly there have been periods of migration, but we still exist in rural communities, are very and have very strong networks in rural communities. The other piece is really the role of faith for us as Black survivors, and particularly in rural communities. And I think the piece that, the challenge that we have to address is, of course, faith is important, but there's also this sort of assumption that church is not a safe place to go. And I think it can be both, right? I think faith leaders can be safe in some spaces, but we've got to educate them, so that they understand how to work with survivors, how to respond effectively to survivors' needs, how to think about our safety, what confidentiality looks like, those kinds of things. I think across socioeconomic levels is another sort of stereotype or assumption that we have around particularly Black survivors in rural communities and how we show up.
mhm,
And then I think, the idea that we don't want help. And what do I mean by that? the idea that we have to bear everything, and that is consistent whether you're talking about Black folks in rural communities or you're talking about those of us in urban communities. I think one of the things that we assume is that we're not going to reach out for assistance or we're not going to reach out for help. And I know, Ayana, we're going to talk a little bit later about, some systemic challenges and those types of things, but I always want to make sure that we understand that when we reach out, we do deserve to be helped. We do deserve assistance. And sometimes what I see happen is this analysis that, Black women especially are strong enough to deal with their own issues. Black women have community enough to deal with their own issues. And so we don't have to provide the same level of assistance to Black survivors. And I think that that's something that has got to be challenged, both within our own community and outside of our community.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to merge these questions for you. But what then does it mean to do culturally specific work? And why is it important for especially mainstream advocates to really lean into intersectionality?
Well, I think one is that we don't experience violence the same. None of us experiences violence the same. Historical trauma, our experiences with systems, all impact the ways that we seek help, the ways that we experience violence, the ways that we show up when we are seeking help. And so culturally specific programs are important because we understand those realities, right? There's an innate understanding of how we show up and why we show up in that manner. Like, why would we be hesitant to perhaps call law enforcement? Why are we hesitant to engage with systems? Why do we show up and not necessarily call ourselves victims? Very often we don't show up and call ourselves victims. We don't see ourselves in that framework. And so there's also some discussions around what are we experiencing and how do we talk about violence, which may be different from how you talk about it in a mainstream context. So, and the other thing that I really think is important is for us to name the fact that we may show up overrepresented in some systems, and that does not mean that we are being served well.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, that means that there's another systemic issue. So, for instance, we may be overrepresented in shelter because we're underrepresented in housing opportunities, right? We may be overrepresented in some systems because our communities are over policed. And so, there's also got to be this understanding of that intersection where, okay, why do I need to create culturally specific programming for Black communities when I see Black survivors in my program? Well, they may not be being served well. The other
Hmm.
thing is really understanding that there is a Black culture and language that is specific to us in our communities. And so very often when we talk about culturally specific services that are grounded in our experiences and grounded in our own linguistic experiences, that gets overlooked for us as a Black community.
And how important it really is. Like, I need to be able to communicate with you, not just talk.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of those things are not verbal, right?
Mm.
You and I can have a conversation, and there are some cues that I'm going to pick up from you, Ayana, that are very much nonverbal, but because of our cultural experiences and because of the context in which we engage, we understand what those nonverbal communications mean.
Absolutely. And we've done like right, it's very natural, right? And so to not take away from the natural part of how we maneuver through the world, and really amplify that as that's part of safety planning when you can really communicate with someone on a deeper level. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I want to shift gears, not even really, but just a smidge, to thinking about some of the power and control dynamics that show up or present themselves in abusive relationships, and again, how they look different from potentially in urban settings.
Mhm.
So I'm going to pose it to the group first. What type of power and control dynamics are showing up? How are folks identifying them? And how might they be different than in urban settings? And anybody can raise your hand or start us out in the chat.
And y'all have to know we're the kind of group that you may not raise your hand, so we start calling on people, right?
Especially for people I know in the chat. I know your name, honey. We're friends. We'll call you first. So, what type of power control dynamics? Okay, transportation issues and access to services. Absolutely. What else? Everybody knows everyone. Absolutely. Yeah, rural communities are really interesting because on one hand, everybody knows each other, and on the other hand, it can be very isolated, right? Or isolating. Dismissive attitude by law enforcement. Thank you, Paul. Connections to friendly law enforcement with the abusive partner. Extreme isolation, absolutely. What else comes to mind? Rules and policies and housing programs, absolutely. Courts are family. Family on one side of the courts are family on one side of the event. Yep. Small town, big county. What happens in the home stays in the home. Absolutely. Limited safe housing options. Sarah echoes the transportation, as well as systemic discrimination. Great point. Anything else? Think about the complexities when you're safety planning and when you're working with folks. Financial isolation, absolutely. Less access to jobs that allow for separation or removal from the situation. Yep. Survivors who have a long history of abuse become labeled in the community, leading to bias in the justice system. That's a great point, Destiny. Absolutely. And so, and then another one, no access to shelter options are too far away to be reasonably accessed. Absolutely. Karma, do you have other thoughts or anything to add about this question? I know you were sort of speaking to some of these issues already.
Well, I'll echo a couple of things. And just like I thought, we've got the experts in the room. So thank you all so much for dropping those things in the chat. I mean, definitely what I've, seen and experienced around lack of transportation or access to transportation, isolation being so important, access to resources. The idea of outing people in rural communities is is a particular issue specific, and we're not just talking about based on gender or sexuality, but just that the violence is even occurring in your home, and that being something that gets used against survivors, particularly when you're in a close-knit community where there's an expectation that you show up in a specific way. And so outing can be used as a way of keep maintaining control and exerting control. I've seen particularly for immigrant survivors living in community and rural community status being a huge area of power and control and being used against survivors. And we see that across the board, but particularly in rural communities. The access to all the resources that got named in the chat, but especially courts and legal services
Mhm.
and housing services being very real challenges for survivors in rural communities. And then the financial isolation, so important. Bias in all systems, so important. One of the other things we talked about family and a rich history being a certainly one of the things that we rely on in rural communities, and an absolute strength in rural communities that can also be a challenge, right? Where you are close with the abuser side of the family as well as your own side of the family. And so what we've seen oftentimes in rural communities is that the abuse is not only coming from one individual, right? That once you share that there's abusive tactics being used in the relationship, etc., then that also gets piled on by the rest of the family. Or there is the goal for the rest of the family for you not to share that information. So I think someone said, keeping what happens inside of the home and inside of the family close, that extends to not just your home, but all of the familial home per se, that you're not sharing outside of our network and
Mhm.
our family.
And I always find it really interesting that piece in particular because I heard that a lot just in community growing up. What happens in the community stays in the community. What happens in the home stays in the home. So you have the dual impact of like that's Black culture and it's rural culture too, competing for how you can really tell your story or not. Oh, I see a comment from Paul. Easy to isolate the victim, difficult to hide from the abuser.
Right. What we often saw that was very difficult for survivors in rural communities is the loss of community, right? That oftentimes the expectation for us as providers is that the survivor then leaves an abusive home or leaves her community in order to maintain safety. But when you're living, you have, generations of family living
Mhm.
in a community. The idea of losing that family and losing that community for many survivors is just as challenging for them as experiencing the harm.
Hmm. And so, what then is your perspective or your thoughts around covering your basis in advocacy and, covering, checking off things we know we need to address in safety planning, but not falling into a one size fits all approach?
I think the most important thing, and we say this sometimes almost we take for granted the idea of listening to survivors.
Hmm.
But it is so very true now, as much as it was when we first talked about doing this work, because survivors do know their own experiences and they will tell us. And so, one of the things that, we've been talking about, Ayana, through Ujima, and I see Chris online as well, but we've been talking about how do we keep survivors safe in their own community? So that expectation that someone has to leave in order to gain safety, we've got to shift because survivors are telling us they don't want to do that. They want their kids to have that familial connection. They want to maintain that familial connection. They still want to be able to go to their church. They still want to be able to see their grandmother. So how do we build safety systems within our community so that survivors don't have to leave all the other things that are keeping them whole in order to achieve physical safety?
Absolutely. And I would love to hear from folks in the audience as well. What have you all done to really, support survivors, meeting them where they are, doing safety planning that's meaningful and actually thorough with them? What does that look like for you all? Anyone have anything? How have you supported survivors in, really acknowledging what their expressed needs are? Orders for protection with very specific location restrictions, distance from the home, other important locations and community. Yes, thank you, Desiree. Collaboration with is that law enforcement agencies? Tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about that, Paul, in the chat. What else?
I'll tell you, Ayana, one of the things that I learned very on in working in a rural community, and like I said, I started my work there, is that we when we started talking about domestic violence in communities, when we set up domestic violence related programs, we did not call them domestic violence specific. We had things like exercise classes, community meetings, cooking classes, things like that, because the isolation is very real, the very tight-knit community is very real, and we don't talk about violence in the same way. And
Mhm.
so we had to create spaces of um, community and of cover for survivors so that they could express what was happening in their homes, but they didn't have to show up in a domestic violence program, right? They could. And this is so important. I think unique to rural communities is that we lead with community, and particularly for us as Black community, we lead with community. So we want to be in spaces, community first, and then the victimization is something that we talk about later. But we've got to feel safe first.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, or we might come, but we're not gonna stay.
Right.
So there were some other great comments that came through. Mobile advocacy, meeting survivors where they are physically, especially in a town with minimal public transportation. That's great, Destiny. Safety planning around specific situations in their lives. So when you go to the grocery store, church, etc., what happens when you run into your abusive partner. Paul, thank you for expanding. So they've worked with law enforcement to create safety plans with county sheriffs. Chris said allowing them to take the driver's seat. Yes, sometimes survivors can feel overwhelmed with services, right? So like actually taking a step back is very helpful to when you want a safety plan because throwing too much out there can be too much for people. Co-advocacy models where survivors work with both mainstream and culturally specific programs to try to offer a holistic service approach, very comprehensive safety planning that considers physical, emotional, and social well-being. Absolutely. And I see Faith says making sure to tell them that they are the experts in their own lives to help empower them to decide what will work in their lives versus telling them what they should do. Absolutely. And so, we've really already been we've started talking through it, but you mentioned, there are programs where the thought process is like, well, they'll adapt to what we have here versus us adapting to what survivors need. What kind of harm is caused when we expect survivors to show up the way we want versus showing up for them the way they need?
Well, I think you named it, Ayana, just a moment ago, where you said we may show up, but we won't stay, right?
Mhm.
Like the idea that when you are forcing someone into your puzzle piece, then they can't, one, show up as their true self. They can't show up as their whole self. They don't get to define what safety looks like for them. So you are giving an idea of what safety means, but that safety may not be the same picture that they have. So then that means that I'm not going to stay. I'm not going to feel comfortable. I'm not going to feel safe in this space. And so it's not a place where I can actually heal.
Mhm.
And so the harm that we create is one for that individual, right? That one survivor. But we also have to be very clear. Our community, and particularly in the rural community, we talk about whether or not this service felt comfortable to me, whether or not this is a safe space to go. So you cause harm for that individual, but it's also reverberates throughout the community. So other survivors don't see you as a safe space. Other survivors don't see this program as something to save. So we run the risk of isolating an individual so that they don't have the healing and don't have the safety necessary and that self-defined healing and self-defined safety so that it shows up in the way that they need and in the way that they define. And then we also run the risk of not only isolating that individual, but also telling other survivors that this is not a safe space for them either.
Mhm.
And so it causes individual harm and also collective harm.
Absolutely. And I think it's just a good reminder, like there might not be many services in the area, right? And so if it spreads, and it will spread like wildfire in the community, because I know when I have a bad experience, I'm going to tell my mama, I'm going to go tell my friends and their mamas and their
Right.
cousins and whoever else, right? And so to think about, we want to make sure that survivors are actually being treated well in the programs that they're coming to receive. And so if we don't treat folks well, it's going to spread in the community even more so than the good news and the good things. Right. Chris
And
said at least three people. Absolutely.
I have to say, because when I started doing the work, one of the things when you started talking about culturally specific programs, and I worked with in mainstream programs, we got as far as Black folks need hair products and certain food. And that was it. That was the
Mhm.
context of what culturally specific services meant for us. And it had nothing to do with safety, wellness, healing, all of those things that we just talked about and that we see in the chat. So that's the other piece of the risk that we run. If you don't understand what it means to provide culturally specific and in a mainstream context, you can still provide culturally sensitive services, if it stops at just those very surface level things, then you don't get to what real healing means. You're only touching people at the surface level, and so they don't feel safe. They haven't had an opportunity to heal. I mean, one of the things that for Black women that's so important is just a sense of rest. Like, can I just rest? If you are peppering individuals with a million questions the moment they walk into your program, and you're talking about for Black women who are dealing with all kinds of other systemic inequities, you haven't had time to just sit down and rest, right? And so for many of us that gets seen as an unwillingness to participate in the program, right? Or we're resistant, or we're angry, or we're mad, but we're just tired,
Yeah.
right? And so there's got to be an understanding of what that looks like for us in Black communities and how bias shows up, so that we don't end up harming a survivor in the same time at the same time that we're supposed to be creating spaces for healing and safety.
Absolutely. And I even think about, a lot of times our responses, we as advocates, when we're seeing survivor behavior, when we're seeing survivors show up or not show up, like if they're not showing up for meetings, we're starting to take it personally as if they don't want to meet with us. They may love you as an advocate and still not want to meet with you because they're tired, right? Like back to that, it's not really about us as individual advocates. We still represent a system that they have to now engage with. We still represent services they might have to fight for. And so acknowledging there are a whole bunch of other layers going on in people's experience, I think is really important.
Well, and we also, have spent years in a with a harm doer where you've had to bottle up all of your emotions and haven't been
Yes.
able to speak honestly and put your feelings first. And so the idea that people will continue to bottle up all of those emotions when they come to us for safety or healing, it's not fair to the survivor. So all the things that we then say, oh, you get a you get a demerit, or no, you're not compliant with our program, or why is she so emotional in this space, is because you spent years bottling all of those things up, not only in your home but also in what it means to walk this life as a Black woman. And
Mhm.
so then those things come tumbling out when you get to unpack it. And so there's got to be an understanding of what that means for us culturally, what that means for us in terms of our experiences. And then, the other real thing that I see happen in a lot of mainstream programs is not understanding parenting styles, not understanding how we deal with our kids, not understanding how we show up with systems. And so that then causes another layer of harm.
Mhm. And I know this was not one of my drafted questions, Carmen, but you know I am. So, can you talk to us just a smidge about some of the other racialized tropes that come up, especially in shelter settings, and how they impact Black survivors?
Well, we've seen it over and over again. One of my biggest pet peeves is how many advocates I worked with that say these survivors are just using services. They're just coming to us for housing. They're just coming to us for food. They're taking more than one gift at Christmas time. They're not grateful that we gave them this outfit. Like those things. And I'm like, if someone takes an extra bagel, really?
Right.
Or if they get an extra gift for their kid, and it comes from for in a real space for us, there are, we're worried about resources and we're worried about all the other things. So there's that. But we have to deal with our own bias around that. That we can't place that on the survivor. And I see that very, especially when I think about how we deal with Black women.
Mhm.
The other thing is, I started doing a program around economic justice and economic advocacy. And one of the things that I saw was the way that we deal with economics is different with Black women and other women. This idea that we can't handle money. And I can tell you, Black women can make a dollar work, but the idea that you have to teach us about just like how to manage money and all the things, when it's not that we don't know how to manage money, we don't have the economics to do it, right?
We
So
don't have enough.
we don't have enough. And so, if your only advocacy is about how you teach someone to balance a checkbook, when it's not about how do you build up the resources to actually balance a checkbook, those two things don't work well for a survivor in their real life. Um, and then the tropes around parenting, the tropes around an angry black woman, an angry black woman are very real. The tropes around us being over sexualized and hypersexualized, so that anytime you're engaged with a person, then you know what's the context of that relationship. And so all of those things show up with us. And then just the real, very real sense that there is some layer of criminality for us that we are innately criminal. So when we come into programs, you've got to over police us to make sure we're going to follow rules,
Mhm.
still exist for us when we seek services.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna move off the point in just a second, but I really am so interested always in the ties between, we were talking about economic inequality, Black womanhood, geographical isolation. Um, how do those different pieces further shape how violence is normalized or accepted against Black women?
So, all of those things show up in I've been talking a lot about what it means to be holistic, what it means to have opportunities for healing. When we don't have the economic options of care for ourselves and our children, we make different choices, right? So if you don't feel like, I'm often talking about housing, and there's a difference between just having housing and then having safe and comfortable housing. And so
Mhm.
having options around safe, affordable, and comfortable housing for survivors is very important. And in the rural context, when that can be limited, it then is a challenge, an additional layer, an additional challenge, and or a hurdle for survivors. The isolation is real, right? I spoke to it a moment ago around what it means to be a part of community. So when you lose community, how you experience violence is very different, right? The ways in which you experience violence mean that you are totally alone, means that you feel like you have no help. The idea that there's no one to call, the idea that it's only you, and then you add children to that experience, and it's so very layered. And then things like not having access to transportation. I know my family is from a rural community, and oftentimes the internet is in and out, right? Like, so your cell phone is in and out, the internet is in and out. So those traditional things that we rely on oftentimes to say, okay, well, you can just call 911 or just flee, take your cell phone and call 911. Those things may not be available in rural communities. So we've got to think about safety differently. And we've got a safety plan differently so that we have an understanding of, what does it mean when someone doesn't have a cell phone? What does it mean when they can't go to the bank or the ATM at midnight? So they gotta, plan when they can gain access to cash. What does it mean when my child may only have one school in a 50-mile radius? So me just moving is not that easy if I want them to be able to maintain community. All of those things look different in a rural community.
Absolutely. And until you're really immersed in the work, those aren't things that advocates generally are taught to really think through. And so there's a lot of creativity that goes into safety planning in rural communities. There are a lot of just tapping into what you know. And yeah, I love those different points. So I'm going to open this up to folks in the audience first. When it comes to survivor-centered advocacy and what it can truly look like or actually requires, um, oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. What does survivor-centered advocacy truly look like or require when options, resources, or staff capacity are limited? And I want to hear from you all first. What does it look like when we have few resources, our staff is limited? We're already dealing creativity, absolutely. Give me more, Keely, on what that looks like. What comes to mind?
Hmm. Ayana, you're on mute, but
Oh, I'm surely reading through the comments too.
I
I saw sometimes you have to think outside the box instead of straight to the solutions that you want or are used to. Absolutely. Chris said sometimes burnout happens. I think that's a very real reality that we need to talk through. Researching and making a plan for additional access points. That's absolutely great, Madison. Coming together as a team to work through a problem. Creativity with what you have and looking toward those who may have what you're missing. You might have you might have the bread, but the community might have the meat. I love that. Coming up with new ideas to assist. Angela, any thoughts on what some of those new ideas have been for you? Working with the survivor and identifying supports they currently have and the resources available to them. Absolutely, always a great starting point. Helping individuals get connected to resources that you do have access to, even if they aren't already. Help them reach whatever goal they are reaching toward and work on that. I think tangible markers are always good to work with survivors, letting them know, like, if like be real with survivors. You may not get housing here, and not phrase it the way you need to, but a reality is you might not automatically get into that transitional housing program in this 30 days that you have here. But what are the goals that we can get you closer to that, right? So not making false promises, really giving them all of the information that they need. Informed consent is a very big piece that we sometimes don't do the best at in advocacy, but is really important for working with survivors. Working with cross-sector organizations to resource share and collaborate on creative solutions. Absolutely. Karma, what are your thoughts? What does survivor-centered advocacy look like when the options, resources, or staff capacity is limited?
think, one is the really centering the survivor. So listening to and acting on the wishes of that survivor, even when they aren't ours. Um,
Hmm.
or even when they are opposed to the ideas that we have. I think, rest is and for me to say this, I know you're laughing, but
You've gotten a little better, Karma. You've gotten a little better.
but we have got to provide spaces for survivors to rest. We cannot, this idea that people will work the program and that's like their whole job while they're with us, that cannot be the only thing that we lay in front of survivors. They have to have the space to make options. And sometimes that means kind of like clearing out all the other things that are in your mind and spirit in order to be able to make decisions and make determinations. And one of the things that's really important for me, Ayana, is it's hard for me to have this conversation about survivor-centered services without also talking about the realities for advocates providing services.
Mm,
Because an advocate can't, it's very hard for an advocate to advocate for a survivor to have economic resources when the advocate themselves does not have economic resources. It's very hard for an advocate to advocate for rest for survivors when the advocate has not had a vacation or a time and space for rest themselves. It's very hard for us to talk about access to healthcare. We haven't even talked about that. Like, so the challenges around, hospitals
yeah.
in rural communities, like, and even now when you have more and more hospitals that are closing and health centers that are closing in rural communities. So survivors getting access to safe health care is important. But when advocates also don't have health care themselves, it's hard to advocate. When we live in rural communities and you are the one, so everyone knows you as the person, right? It happens to doctors, it happens to law enforcement, it happens to all those things. And so advocates, the very same thing. Everybody knows you're the person that knows about safety planning and knows about, so there's never a time off. And
Hmm.
so I think one of the things that's challenging for us as advocates doing this work, for those of us that are leading organizations, for those of us that are in supervision positions at organizations, is creating the time for advocates to unpack vicarious trauma, for advocates to get space and rest, advocating for more pay for those individuals that are working in our programs. That then leads to survivor-centered services because the advocate themselves is taken care of, so they have the space to then advocate fully for the survivor that they're working with.
Absolutely. And I think, from my conversations just with other advocates recently in the last 6 months, those are all of the things that they're talking about needing support around in order to really continue to support survivors too. For folks in the audience, do you have other things you wanted to add? I saw a couple comments come through that I'll just add for us. When you don't have access to resources you normally had access to, it's brainstorming ways to provide services that are going to be just as effective as the original way, but as helpful. Reassuring them that as an advocate and let reassuring them that as an advocate and letting them know that they are capable of making their own decisions. Sometimes survivors are afraid to take steps forward alone because others may have always made the decisions for them. Absolutely. Is it Nisi said I'm struggling with that right now. I know that was when around the time we were talking about hospitals and access. Other things coming up, other barriers, other obstacles, other points of consideration that have come up more and more for you all. Um, it's useful to bring services to one location, like a one-stop shop. Absolutely. That doesn't always have to be a justice center, right? Like someone mentioned mobile advocacy. You can sometimes do pop-up service provision, in community. I think that's a great way, not always making sure it's tied to law enforcement. Church, as well, Chris, thank you, they're great partners to have, especially when they are really invested in making sure violence ends in community, right? What else? Any other thoughts? Coordinated community response teams are great to join and partner with. Candria, you actually led me to my next question. How can rural advocates strengthen partnerships and coordinated community responses? And what partnerships are often missed in rural response efforts? And you can start us out, Karma.
Okay. I mean, I think, of course, the partnerships with faith communities are important. Um, the partnerships with other service agencies are important. The partnerships with, one of the things that we've got to do, not only in rural communities, but particularly in rural communities, is make sure that people know that our services are available. So the partnerships with media outlets and those kinds of things are incredibly important because survivors need to know how to reach us.
Mhm.
The traditional partnerships with law enforcement and courts and others are also important, so we know those spaces that we're able to advocate. One of the other things in rural communities that's really important is the partnership with schools, so that because oftentimes people are showing up in the education system, and teachers and other administrations need to know how to reach them. But things like partnerships with barbershops and hair salons and all those places, those other places where people seek support, but in a more congenial way, right? So you're going to talk to your hairdresser, you're going to talk to your barber, you're going to talk to your pastor or talk to the first lady, and so you're not showing up for traditional services, but maybe may disclose, and those individuals need to know how to help. They need to know where to make referrals, and they need to know as much what not to say as they know what to say.
Absolutely. And there's a great comment in the chat. I heard of having an auto body shop as a partner. Victims sometimes don't have dependable cars, but having a mechanic who can fix their cars is really important, especially important to them being able to leave or Um, yeah, I think that's great. I think, the suggestion about barbers and hairstylists, those are great folks to go to because people tell their business to them anyways. And we really want folks to have a great response when they are hearing disclosure. Any other thoughts? Oh, I see a comment. Our rural community has created a family resource center. The hope is that different resources in the community have office hours at this location. And so it's a one-stop shop. I love that. Maybe a financial advisor from your local bank to
Right.
help with financial planning. That's a great
Right.
suggestion.
Hmm.
Even just to walk people through how to open a bank account. Like there are a lot of survivors who they may have access to a bank account, but they don't know how to open one by themselves. Or they don't know how to move money around or in their investments. Like there are a lot of different ways to get creative with that'll help people get what they need. I love that. So I have a few more questions left, and then I'll open it to anybody else that might have some questions. But what do you think the outcomes would be if there was real and intentional investment in Black survivor leadership within rural communities?
I think we see real safety for Black women, right? And safety on multiple layers, right? You're talking about physical safety, we're talking about emotional safety, and it goes beyond safety, but wellness. I think you see a shift in the conversation from simply from intervention to what it really looks like to prevent violence from happening.
Mhm.
I think you see programs and services that aren't reliant upon the survivor leaving or being divorced from her community, but are really about keeping you safe where you are. I think we see that when we empower Black women, it makes the whole community safe. So when you make Black women safer, you will make the community safer. And so in empowering Black women and empowering Black women in this space, is not what we will see is then that the community as a whole becomes a safer place.
Mhm. And then I would love your top three thoughts around this. What changes are needed at an organizational, community, or policy level to best support survivors?
Changes at an organizational, community, or policy level. Now, why would you say top three?
If you need to sneak in a few more, you can.
I think the real tenet around being survivor centered and survivor led goes across all three of those areas, right? Organizationally, it means that, we don't prescribe services, but we are responsive in our services. From a community level, it means that we really talk about accountability for harm doers at the same time that we talk about safety for survivors. And from a policy level, it means the same that we really talk about safety as it ties to housing, as it ties to economics, as it ties to access to transportation, as it ties to educational opportunities. But safety is not something that is reactionary. It really is. When we think about having economic options, then women have different choices they can make. When we think about having safe and affordable housing for everyone, then we have different choices that we can make. And so that idea of being survivor driven across all of those areas as a basic tenet.
Mhm.
And then the other piece that I've been thinking a lot about, Ayana, is that we've got to be thinking about safety, and wellness and access to fresh food and access to housing as the very basic human rights, right? We got to think of those things as the basics. And then ensuring them mean that we can be well as a community. I think oftentimes we think of them as something to achieve, right? That we think about people having access to fresh food, and there isn't an understanding about how that's tied to violence. We think
Right.
about people having housing, and there isn't an understanding about how that's tied to violence. We think about economics as something separate, and there isn't an understanding about how that's tied to violence. And so we've got to see these things as intertwined, as integrated, but then we've also got to see them as basic human rights for all of us, but particularly for Black women. And then the last thing, so you said three, so I took them as three buckets, not
Yeah.
three things. But I would go back to your question about biases for Black women and really addressing those tropes that we have around Black women's experiences with violence, around how we show up, because we've got to do our own internal analysis about how whether or not our programs are truly safe for Black women when they're accessing our services. And what we continue to hear from survivors is that they're not always safe because of those biases that are showing up in our programs. And so on an organizational level, we've got to do that. On a community level, we've got to do that, but it's got to be the tie across all of our policy work as well.
Hmm. And I see um a blowhorn in the chat. So you're definitely on point with that. Folks, do you have other thoughts on some policy, organizational, or community changes that need to happen? Let us know in the chat. One of my policy/organizational changes that I strongly am just screaming to organizations is around curfews in shelter. Please get rid of your curfew policies. They actually don't make survivors safer at all, and they're very punitive in ways that are not helpful. So that's like my first thought, like get rid of those. Um, Other folks, what are some thoughts you have on just some very even just subtle changes that we can make that'll better support survivors? I know folks are typing. I think about the Crown Act as like policy wise, what that would mean to survivors. And basically, the Crown Act is legislation that protects natural hair in the workplace. And so I've had my brother-in-law, for instance, most of my family have locks at this point. My brother-in-law, for instance, was told he would never get a supervisor job until he cut his hair. Right. And so to think about that seems very simple for folks, but to think about a survivor, we're like, go get that job. Why can't you get your job? And they're like, I'm facing these type of things on the other side.
I think about things around maternal and infant mortality and the advocacy around that, policy related issues around that.
Hmm.
Um, I think about particularly right now, making sure that, and these are organizational policies, so legislative policies, but our policies within our programs and how we're supporting advocates. So
Yeah.
allowing for healthcare, allowing for equal pay, allowing for vacations, but those are the smaller P things that are also important when we think about policy change.
Hmm. I see Paul added, make the intake as short as possible, have as few rules as possible, and know it's okay to rest. Absolutely. Um, There was a question, could you expand on the curfew hours? I know some shelters put them in place so that they know survivors are safe and make it home every night, but I'd love to hear more about about your thought process. So, for instance, a survivor that has a high lethality score, you telling them they have to be back in shelter by 8 o'clock p.m. every night is not going to actually make them any safer if their lethality score is that, because they could walk out of the shelter at 10 o'clock and be killed by their partner if their partner really wants to kill them. And so, what we need to do is stop trying to parent, especially adult survivors who themselves often have children. We need to think about that there are other options, right? So, like people wanting to go out and be out with their families and not having to rush home as if they're rushing home to their abusive partner. Like, that's how it feels. Or when we have third shift workers who, yeah, they found that job and it was a factory job and now they have to work third shift and you're telling them they can't be out late at night or else they don't need their space for safety. And that's not the case, right? So really, again, thinking about what is actually protective for survivors versus what is really based in control and based in that, again, the limited space, the limited bed options, just the limited perspective, expanding what we're doing with survivors. So that was my thought process. I can go into a lot more, so I'm trying to tone myself down because I go on a lot of tangents, but I see another comment, no compliance requirements for program eligibility. Survivors shouldn't have to do anything. Organizations are there for them and should not require efforts to be made as defined by those organizations. Absolutely. The Texas Council for Family Violence actually they've they've sent out a whole bunch of new resources in terms of their shelter policies and rules, and a lot of that has changed in Texas, for instance, around like you cannot mandate all of those different services and expect people to really show up that way. Cross-sectional training. Where'd it go? Oh, cross-sectional training. I think to Paul's point, who is our housing go-to for when we run into problems? And I wonder if we have people who can relieve him when he's gone. I echo the low barrier shelters. Hold on, comments coming in. I would love to see policies relating to mandatory training for whatever folks call their child protective services, as well as youth juvenile justice services. Absolutely. I think about some stakeholders making Black women the face of intimate partner violence just for the namesake, but not in policy. We hear about the statistics that we are the most abused group, but resources do not look like us. Hopefully that makes sense. It does. So being, put at the spotlight of this is who's being impacted, but when we actually are seeing what's behind the scenes, the services, the way we talk to survivors are not culturally responsive. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think the piece around child welfare is especially poignant. When survivors are going in for services or for support, and the ways in which we sometimes ask questions to prompt, a call to CPS, we really need to reevaluate why we're doing that or why we're posing questions in a way that we know is going to prompt, an investigation where it might be unnecessary or shelter rules. When I was in shelter as a case manager, there were a lot of rules around who can watch your children.
Right.
Or if you leave your children in the room and you come to the front office, that's too much distance. Or if you leave your kids and they're in Maryland, for instance, I don't remember if it's the same everywhere, but in Maryland, for instance, if you're older than 8, you're allowed to be left by yourself for a few hours at a time. We had it where there were 16-year-olds being told they can't be home by themselves for half the day, and essentially people wanting to call child welfare. Why? Why would we do that to survivors when they legally haven't done anything wrong? There are people in the shelter that they might have had watch their children or who are old enough to watch themselves. Why would we do that to them, right? And so really challenging and questioning some of the things that are just in place for whatever reason. And again, coming up with those creative solutions that we've talked about. Karma, did you want to add anything?
I think they covered it. I mean, I'm just so happy to be in community and hearing what advocates are doing and the ways that we're thinking creatively. I think, one of the things that I heard often in direct services was the women who said, I can't come to that program and risk losing my kids.
Hmm.
And that stuck with me so much in how we advocate for mom and for their kids, but without putting them both at risk. So that comment just resonated with me.
Absolutely. And I see a comment from Destiny, trainings and conversations with partner programs or resources on the recognition of biases or barriers in the organizations. It's not helpful for us to refer a survivor to an org that we know is consistently harming them. An organization in my town requires a license and car insurance for gas support if you have to take them. Um, wow. If you have to take an obvious sheet of paper to register at a gas station. Wow. Right? So again, what barriers are we putting in place versus what barriers have been in place? and where we can find a little bit more grace for folks to actually, again, make the changes that they need for themselves.
And I think one of the things, Ayana, that we have to be very mindful about is analyzing whether or not we are putting policies in place to make our jobs easier for, or if it's really about survivor safety. Because
Yeah.
sometimes when we see things like curfews and things like that, it makes our jobs easier to know that everyone's going to be in, at a certain time, or to know that we don't have to hire someone who's there 24 hours. And we pass that off as about the safety of survivors. And
Mhm.
so we've got to do that regular analysis. The other piece is we've got to build into our program space for that kind of analysis. So
Yeah.
if the only thing you're doing is responding to crisis and you haven't built in time for reflection, then you don't have an opportunity to think through some of these, like, why do we have this policy in place? And then the other piece that is really important to me is that we don't create policies to address one specific issue. We deal
Hmm.
with that issue. So if you have an issue with a specific survivor who acted out, and I say that in quotes because that's one of my pet peeves as well.
Yeah.
But you have a specific survivor and you create a policy to deal with one person's issue, then that's not good policy development, right? We need to create space where we are able to have healthy conflict, where we're able to address an issue without then going our default being, okay, we've got to create that policy because what if the next person does it, right?
Right. Right. And I think, again, to your point, like a lot of this is very well intentioned. There is well intention behind it, and there's so many gaps to understanding that it doesn't come off
Hmm.
as well intentioned. And so I've worked with a program, they were providing legal services to survivors. And they had mentioned, a lot of the Black women we were serving were talking about they don't want to, criminalize their partner. They don't want to follow up with charges. So we just simply stop pursuing charges for for perpetrators. And I was like, but did everyone say that? Or
Right.
because a few people said that, you made this overarching change that's ultimately not protecting and serving survivors in the way they asked.
Right. And then we got to be nimble. If you tried something and it didn't work, then you
Yeah,
got to be able to say, okay, this didn't work, and we're able to shift or switch courses.
absolutely. All right, so last question. Final thought. If you were able to make two wishes, just two, Karma, two wishes, one for survivors and one for advocates, what would they be?
Oh, okay. Oh, I have a way to kind of get around this one.
Okay. See, you see what we're doing, advocacy?
So one of those wishes would be for both advocates and survivors to truly have the resources they need to live full lives, right? To have health care, to have salaries, not just pay, but have
Hmm.
salaries that come with benefits.
Hmm.
To have spaces for rest and restoration. So that would be one of my wishes. The second one would really be for us to create space to do our own healing in trauma, and so I'm going to put that in the advocate bucket because oftentimes advocates, I think we pretend like survivors are a them instead of an
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And many of us as survivors have also experienced the violence that we're working to address, and we haven't had the space, the time, to deal with our own trauma. So I would say, that we have that space and time to also deal with our own trauma so that we can show up as better advocates in these spaces. And then for survivors, it would be the ability for them to have their own autonomy, to write their own plan for life, right? And that not only shows up that we don't simply define survivors as survivors or victims, but that we address the full reality of what they want for their lives and their spaces, so that we're dealing. And I saw so many amazing pieces in the chat where it's like, okay, working with banks so survivors can have bank accounts,
Yeah,
and they can have financial freedom, where we're talking about liberation so that survivors actually have space to be free and full. And we're not just talking about physical safety.
absolutely. Absolutely. I see one comment so far in the chat that I don't want to miss. There was a question. Oh, hey, Jackie. I had a quick question for the group. I had the opportunity to speak at a community event where there was a large population of deaf residents. Outside of Dawn, are there any other organizations that you all know of or would recommend? Some of the residents expressed concerns regarding Dawn due to the close-knit nature of the community, especially the Black deaf community or the deaf community in general, um, and the perception that some interpreters may be personally connected to individuals.
Mhm.
So if anyone does have some orgs that they could reference, please let us know. Jackie, I'm going to take this with me for follow-up.
Mhm.
I know that the New Jersey Coalition, no, it's not off topic. I know
No.
that the New Jersey Coalition does a lot of great work. They have a large deaf population out there too. So I'll refer to them and then see what other orgs we can find that specifically serve the deaf community.
And Paul had a suggestion, Ayana, to bring
Mhm.
in, Paul had a suggestion to bring in interpreters and train them as volunteers so that they understand the confidentiality issues, and you broaden the resources.
Absolutely. Yeah, interpreters, translators should absolutely be trained. There's differences when you're doing court interpretation versus when you're doing interpretation over the phone. But either way, I agree, absolutely. They should definitely be informed about confidentiality and just in how to translate some of these concepts, right? Like it's not every day that folks necessarily talk about violence. It's very natural to us, but for a lot of other folks, maybe not. Any other thoughts, comments, questions that folks want to add? You see why I had to bring Karma on today because she's amazing and knows all the things, especially about rural communities. So thank you
Thank you,
so much,
Ayana.
Karma.
Thank you, Ayana, and thank you. This was an incredible group. I think that the chat has so much richness, and expertise and knowledge. So much appreciation to all of you all for sharing.
Absolutely. And so, folks, definitely please stay connected with us. You can catch up with us on social media. We'll be posting our upcoming events and programming. We have a lot of great stuff coming up. And we also, I know off the top of my head, we have a culturally specific safety planning workshop coming up that I think you all would be interested in. We have a housing workshop coming up that we have some amazing presenters for as well. And we'll have more of these conversations because they're really important and we know that we need to have them to grow and to continue to support survivors in the best way. So if there are no other thoughts, comments, or questions, I'm going to let us go, not before saying a hearty thank you to our ASL interpreters. We
Yes.
really appreciate you, Michonne and Joshua. And on that note, please do your 15 minutes of self-care mandated by Uchima, mandated by Ayana. You can blame me if you need to, but do your self-care. We really appreciate you, and we'll talk to y'all soon.
Thank you.
Alrighty, thanks, y'all.